Hello, Grumpy Old Fart here. I'm doing a family game night video, Star Trek the Roleplaying Game Stories. And this one I'm entitling Butterfingers. And you'll see what I mean. All right, years ago, and by the way, I tell these stories because I think it's important that we have a family game night because families need to get together and bond, especially in this time when we're not allowed to leave our homes and we're under this forced quarantine bullshit. So, to the story. Years ago, I was running a Star Trek, the role-playing game scenario, and we had 6 players. We had the commanding officer, who was my friend Bobby. The executive officer was Randy. The engineer was Kevin. The Kevin from some of my other stories, and Bobby from the other stories, by the way. The helmsman was a friend of ours named Jerry. Navigation weapons officer was Michael, and the security officer was Edward. And Michael and Edward are brothers. They're competitive, and they are just they're brothers. They bicker like brothers all the time. Now, good guys, by the way. I haven't seen them in years. I love the hell out of them. Good people. But they're brothers, and they bicker. There's nothing you can do about it. They were aboard the starship Farragut, and the mission was that the Farragut was sent to stop pirates in a star system. The pirates had been harassing some of the locals, and they were, stealing cargoes and things like that. So the Farragut went in to investigate. Turns out that there were 4 pirate vessels. They were small vessels, much smaller than the Farragut, but the 4 of them together were quite formidable. And there was a huge battle, and the crew acquitted themselves quite well. Bobby was an excellent commander. Randy took over when the engineer had been wounded. Kevin, he'd gotten wounded. So Randy had taken over for a little bit until Kevin could get back on his feet. They worked well together as a team. It worked really good. So, it turns out during this course of this battle, Bobby and his command staff aboard the Farragut were able to destroy 3 of these pirate ships. But in the process, they had been heavily damaged. They had the smaller pirate ships had concentrated fire and had gotten through some the Farragut shielding in some areas and done some significant damage. They had damaged the warp drive. The phasers were the phaser capacitor was completely destroyed, and main power was out. So there was no way for them to, because the weapon systems were damaged and main power was out, there was no way for them to transfer power from engineering, or transfer antimatter, from engineering to the weapon systems. And for those of you who aren't Star Trek fans, and I know that's hard to believe, apparently, as I understand it, there are some people out there who are not Star Trek fans. I have yet to find anybody who doesn't like Star Trek, but there you go. Apparently they're out there. I don't know. Anyway, the way a photon torpedo works is you have this huge casing with a tiny little minuscule particle of antimatter that's injected into it. And when they fire it, it hits, and the containment field for the antimatter collapses, and the antimatter hits the casing, and it explodes on the surface of the ship, or on the shields, or whatever. But the point being, it becomes a fireball at that point. Very destructive fireball. A tiny little speck of antimatter is enough to power a photon torpedo. And so, long story short, they had to find a way to get the antimatter from engineering to the photon torpedo bays. Michael came up with the idea. The weapons officer, he came up with the idea and says, well, if you can get me some antimatter into the weapons bay, I can inject it manually, and we can fire a photon torpedo. And excuse me. And so that was the order, And so Kevin headed down to engineering, and he was down in engineering earlier, and he started extracting antimatter for them to take to the weapons bay, and he figured, well, we might need some more, so he put a little extra in there, a container of antimatter. And so he was almost ready. Michael and Edward, the weapons officer, navigation weapons, same console, and the security officer, Michael and Edward, the brothers, they headed down to get this antimatter and take it over to the weapons bay. And they got there, and Kevin had it all extracted and ready to go. He said, and Kevin said, well, let me get an anti-grav so you can carry it. And they were like, nah, we'll just carry it. We're big, strong guys. We can carry it. And so Kevin said, no, wait a minute. You got to have an anti-grav thing, because if you drop this thing and it detonates, this is enough to destroy the whole ship. And, oh no, we ain't got time. We're going to anti-grav. We'll just carry it. So they grabbed it and ran with it, both of them. And keep in mind, the ship was heavily damaged, so pieces of conduit were laying everywhere, and there was rubble laying everywhere. So of course, they opted to carry it, and they're one on each end, and they're carrying it to the weapons bay. And Michael failed a dexterity check, a basic dexterity check, and he tripped and fell, and that antimatter hit the floor. And I rolled, and it didn't detonate. They got lucky, and he's all, oh, thank God. So they get up, and Kevin looked over at him and said, I can get you an anti-grav unit. And they're like, no, well, we ain't got time. So they picked it up and they started running again. And Edward's all, great. And they're heading down there, and they get into the turbo shaft, and the elevator takes them down, and they get out, and because it only goes down so far because they've heavily damaged, they had to get out and carry it down a ladder. So they get out and they're carrying it down a ladder, and Edward fails a dexterity check, and he falls. And Edward was holding on to his end of the antimatter at the time, and so when he fell, he had the hold of the antimatter, and they went with him, and he hit the deck, and the antimatter hit him, and I rolled. The whole ship went up. Kevin tried, everybody tried to say, hey, wait, use an anti-grav, because it floats in the air. It can't fall. You can't go wrong with that. I mean, short of gritting it and slamming it into a wall, there's not real much you can do there. But no, they were bound and determined to show how big and strong they are and how badass they were. And they were carrying that antimatter by hand in a container. And they blowed up the ship real good. So, yeah. Butterfingers. Next time, work smarter, not harder. Butterfingers. You folks have a good day. God bless one and all.